Good afternoon. My name is Huajing Maski, and I serve as the Executive Director of the University of Kentucky Confucius Institute and Office of China Initiatives. Welcome to the University of Kentucky's International Education Week. This year, we face the unprecedented challenges of twin pandemics. While we fight the health crisis of COVID-19, we confront another pandemic of sorts, systemic racism and racial inequality. Educators around the nation are asking themselves, how can we continue to internationalize our campuses in the COVID-19 era? And what can we as educators do to ensure social justice, diversity, and inclusion? It is precisely for this very reason, and also being very intentional, the UK Confucius Institute and the International Center have organized today's Distinguished Speakers event during our International Education Week in support of our campus-wide effort on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We believe it is essential that we come together in solidarity with each other to address racism in all its forms and raise awareness and conscientiousness of issues of inequality and discriminations affecting marginalized populations. We're very grateful to our colleagues at the other Kentucky universities who have joined us to co-facilitate this event so that we can stand united against these grave injustices. It is vital that we work together to educate our students, faculty, and the wider population towards diversity and inclusion. Now, it is my great pleasure to present Dr. Jennifer Greer, Dean of UK's College of Communication and Information, who will introduce today's speaker. Dean Greer joined UK as the Dean of College of Communication and Information in 2019. In addition to her many achievements as a much published scholar, accomplished journalist, teaching award-winning professor in journalism and mass communication, and a college and university leader. She also served as president of the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication in 2017 and 2018. Therefore, it is very fitting that we invite Dean Greer to introduce today's special speaker. Dean Greer will also moderate the questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A time. You can send your questions to the Q&A box or ask them later during the Q&A time. So Dean Greer, over to you.
Thank you so much, Huajing. I'm so honored to be here and to be able to introduce Juju Chang. Juju Chang is an Emmy award-winning co-anchor of ABC News Nightline. She also reports regularly for Good Morning America in 2020. You can imagine how tired she has been just in the past week with all the news that is round the clock that we've been covering, but then also all of 2020. What a year it has been for our journalists. Chang was born in Seoul, South Korea, and she moved to the United States when she was just 4. She speaks of being raised in a struggling immigrant family in Northern California and how that experience shapes how she approaches her role as a journalist, but also as a wife, as a mother of 3 sons, and as a community leader. One of my favorite stories that she shares about the start of her career is being in the 8th grade when she learned that the US hostages were freed from Iran. She recalls jumping on her 10-speed bicycle and riding up and down her street, yelling, "The hostages are free, the hostages are free," broadcasting to the news to all in her neighborhood. As many budding journalists, I did the same, except for I created a magazine that I would share with my neighbors and go sell door to door. She wanted to get credible information and tell people about that information. So a future in broadcast journalism was really the only choice that she could consider when she went to college. Chang graduated with honors from Stanford University with a BA in political science and in communication. She joined ABC News, where she spent the entirety of her journalistic career at an entry-level position behind the camera, and then rose to become a producer for World News Tonight. She made the switch from being behind the camera as a producer to an on-air reporting job, working and getting her training at KGO TV in San Francisco. She then went on to cover DC, the White House, the presidential election in Capitol Hill for News One, and she co-anchored an overnight show for World News Now. In her career, she's covered major breaking news stories in the US, as well as reporting on global issues, especially affecting women in peril in other countries. Her feature profiles, and I love this collection, include everyone from now President-elect Joe Biden to Nicki Minaj to Esther the Wonder Pig. Chang is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and is a founding board member of the Korean American Community Foundation. Her work has been recognized with numerous awards, including multiple Emmys, Gracies, a DuPont, a Murrow, and a Peabody Award. In 2017, she was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Front Page Awards. It's my great honor to turn this over to Juju Chang.
Wow, what an outstanding introduction, Professor Gur. Thank you so much. And before we came on the Zoom publicly, I told Professor Gur how grateful I am to her, because we need educators, because we need more journalists now more than ever. And I think that I'm grateful to Wai Jing. I was telling her offline that in Korea, people often ask me, what do you think is the secret to South Korea's success in 2 generations, 50, 60 years? And I often say Confucius and Dwight D. Eisenhower. And so I'm grateful to her perch at the Confucius Institute. And I'm really grateful to be here with you, mostly because it means I'm not freezing my butt off in the middle of the night in Michigan, waiting for the election returns to come in, which is what I was doing last Tuesday night. I literally hadn't spent that many all-nighters since college, so I feel you. And basically we were waiting for the vote counts to come in, but we had spent days and weeks beforehand doing reporting throughout Michigan. I had interviewed the governor of Michigan, Whitmer. She was telling me about the threats against her that came up because Michigan had been an early leader, sadly, in a statistic you don't want to lead in, which was in COVID deaths. So she instituted a big lockdown and got a lot of protests and a lot of, in fact, an alleged kidnapping plot against her. But on the night of the returns, I had spent the day in polling sites and watched bipartisan teams of vote counters strolling in, talking about what goes on behind those inside the polling stations. And what happens is literally there are bipartisan teams, a Democrat and a Republican, taking absentee votes. And one person will open the envelope, and then the other person will check the signature, and the third person, and then they swap back and forth, and they alternate, all in the name of election integrity. So, I think American elections are incredibly safeguarded, and despite charges and allegations right now, I think democracy is in good hands. So I'm thrilled to be here at UK, and I'm also thrilled that other organizations and other universities, EKU, NKU, Murray State, Wayne State, and are joining University of Kentucky, because I feel like there's so much going on. One of the things that I noticed in the Michigan battleground state is this talk about the changing demographic, right? There's one county in Oakland County that in the 90s was 93% white. And today, it's a leafy suburb, well-to-do. Now it's 75% white. But it's not just about what the demographics are. These are people who are college educated, who work in the tech sector, who work, and whose politics are shifting. And I did a story in Nashville, and there are counties in the South that are the same way. There's a statistic about Nashville that a new person moves to Nashville every 15 minutes, and it's become this hub of music, of the music industry. More songs are recorded in Nashville than any other place in the world, and that kind of changing demographic changes the way people look into the world, because there are multiple perspectives, and that's one of the things that I want to talk about today. I hope you've all persevered through these twin pandemics. I know that it's been really crazy living in New York City at the height of the pandemic there, when literally it was a ghost town. There was nobody on the street. There was nobody walking. All you could hear every 5 or 10 minutes were ambulances going down the street. And what I like to tell my friends who don't live in New York is that, it's not just that we could see the pop-up tents in Central Park where the excess patients and the excess bodies were being kept. But we also knew that if we broke our leg, or if we had a medical condition, that going to a hospital where everyone was overwhelmed was what you didn't want to do in the height of the COVID pandemic. And I think that, now we're seeing this second huge wave of numbers, and it's really alarming. And on top of that, we saw post the murder of George Floyd, another reckoning, because I think what COVID pointed out was the disproportionate impact that the virus was having on Black and Brown communities. And I think that that's something that we can all dig into intellectually. Recently, somebody asked me if I had something that I could reveal about myself that at first glance you wouldn't necessarily know. And I think that Chadwick Boseman, the actor who played the Black Panther, his death showed us all that many of us are struggling with something that you can't see on the outside, right? He was battling cancer and no one knew it. And so before we prejudge someone, before we jump to conclusions about who they are, it's time to sort of look inside. So my secret superpower, if you were to call it that, was that when I was a kid, what you might not know about me is that I was a nationally ranked swimmer. It was everything in my life. I swam 6 days a week. I was, obsessed with it. But by the time I was in high school, I was washed out. I hit puberty. It just wasn't happening anymore. And within short order, I gained a tremendous amount of weight, and I felt like a complete loser and has been. And that was the way that I saw the world. And yet I think what ended up happening was that I developed a keen sense of empathy. And I think that as a journalist is my superpower. It allows me to talk to people, because we don't always talk to people on their best day. We often have to ask people about the worst day of their lives, the day their child died in a drunk driving accident, the day their brother, was lost to the opioid addiction, the day something tragic happened, in a mass shooting to their family. So my empathy, I think in some ways makes me the journalist that I am today. But another part of what you may not know about me, just seeing me, is that I sort of identify as, the poor immigrant child that I grew up as. Now, you might not know that about me because people assume that I'm well-to-do and I'm privileged and all that. But I was born in Korea, as Jennifer said, and I came here at the age of 4. I really felt other a lot growing up. And I remember following my dad around and watching him be emasculated by being treated badly, if not differently, if not humiliated, because he had a thick accent, or because he seemed confused because he was having a little bit of a hard time understanding somebody's rapid fire English. And I've carried that with me as an immigrant, as somebody who is often meant to feel other. Like, I've spent a lot of time of my adult life having people ask me, where are you from? And that question can mean 100 things, but often they mean, where are you from ethnically, right? And sometimes I mess with them and I say, oh, I'm from California. And they go, no, 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 no. Where are you really from? And what that question implies is that you're not from here. You're not American. There's a slight unconscious bias, right? And you're thinking, well, that's harmless. They didn't mean anything by it, right? I've sat at bars, right, across from men, and I'll forgive them because I'm sure there were a couple of drinks in, but they'll take one look at me and they say, oh, you're so exotic. And I'm thinking like, yo, buddy, you are not seeing me. You're seeing some, I don't know, prejudged stereotype of what you think of as an Asian woman. And that is not something that anyone wants. You don't want anyone to see just a prototype of you, right? The truth is I am an immigrant, but you didn't know that just by looking at me. And a lot of people have said to me, they take one look at me and they say, you speak English really well. And I don't quite know what to take of that. This is long after I've become an American citizen. This is long after I graduated from Stanford University, and I've now come up with a comeback. Usually the person who says it is white, and I will say back to them, thank you, so do you. And I just kind of let that sink in for a minute. And you think, well, what's the big deal? They didn't mean any harm by it, right? And I agree. I don't think anyone means any harm by that particular notion. But what that reveals is an unconscious bias that we all kind of have, right? That we assume that because somebody looks like me, they're not from here, right? Where are you from is that question. And that unconscious bias is then activated when the President of the United States stands at the podium and refers to a virus as the China virus or the Wuhan virus, after repeatedly being asked by global health officials or by US health officials to please refer to it as COVID-19, because what that does is it activates people's unconscious bias. I've heard him refer to it as the Wuhan flu. I've heard him refer to it as Kung flu. When he said that, I literally had to stop and ask again, because we know fundamentally that words matter. Because between March and June of this year, after the president started using that nomenclature, at the height of the COVID pandemic, more than 2,100 anti-Asian American hate incidents were recorded. They were reported to a variety of different advocacy groups who compile this kind of data. And the incidents include everything from verbal assaults to physical attacks to workplace discrimination and online harassment. Thousands of acts of aggression. And that is simply the number that somebody actually sat down and made a point to report that incident to a nonprofit organization. Just imagine how many incidents were never reported, right? Of those 832 incidents reported to one nonprofit organization, many included anti-Asian slurs. And I'm going to get specific about this because this isn't just a number. These are humans behind each of these incidents, right? One attacker yelled, bringing that Chinese virus over here, et cetera, during an attack against an Asian American man in San Francisco. It's not that far from here. I'm in Northern California. On May 6th, the assailant reportedly also said, go back to China, F you Chinaman, which is a slur, and F you, you monkey. In another San Francisco incident in June, someone threw a glass bottle at a woman putting her child in her car seat and yelled, go home, blank, blank, racial slur. Then he took the time to spit on her and said, take your disease that's ruining our country and go home. These are reports, again, that somebody took the time to call 911 or to call a nonprofit organization. How many times do you just throw your hands up and get in the car and just drive away? And so we need to be mindful of the fact that it doesn't take much to ignite people's unconscious bias in a way that may not have been the case had that not been whipped up in that frenzy. Part of the reason why I think this kind of anti-Asian bashing happens is that for Asian Americans, there is this sort of myth of the model minority. Well, you're the good minority. And in many ways, that pits you against other minorities, right? But in other ways, it renders people who are struggling within our community invisible. And invisibility or erasure is the other fundamental struggle of Asian Americans in this country. So everyone thinks, oh, AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders, you guys are upwardly mobile. You guys are wealthy, right? Well, the truth is, that's not true at all. That's actually a falsehood. There are parts of New York and New Jersey, and I can look at places in San Francisco and probably throughout the South. In Louisiana, where there are Vietnamese fishing communities, there is a lot of recent immigrant communities. If you go into Queens, there are places that look like Little Pakistan or Little Japantown, full of recent immigrants, full of many undocumented immigrants. What we don't realize when you think of undocumented immigrants, you think of Mexicans. But in fact, there are a lot of Asian Americans who struggle with invisibility because they're in this country without proper papers, right? And so when you look at the levels of poverty, for example, in New York City, there was a 2015 study that showed that in New York City, 9 out of 10 years tracked that Asian Americans had higher levels of poverty than Blacks, than Hispanics, and than whites. And yet at the same time, the Asian American Federation found that government services were at 1%, while the poverty level was at 15%. So that disproportionate support level has to do with this myth of the model minority, this idea that Asian Americans are doing so well, right? If you look at Asian American household incomes, they are high, but they are high for a couple of reasons. If you break down the numbers, Asian American household incomes are bifurcated. There's the group of high-earning, college-educated, living the American dream Asian Americans, right? That's what we think of as the model Asian American myth. The other half are often families that are struggling in small businesses, right? So there are 3 or 4 members of that family working in that small business to earn that one income. So when I was a child, I grew up cleaning my parents' hotel rooms, scrubbing toilets, changing the towels. Trust me, I was not paid for my services. That is the kind of invisible labor that happens in Asian American families. And guess what? During COVID, Asian American unemployment is disproportionately high versus white counterparts, right? And you can imagine why. Some of that has to do with small businesses being hit. Small independently owned businesses that are so small, they're not really tapping into government PPE money, right? I mean, we all saw when the PPE money was released, it went to tons of big businesses. And a lot of the small businesses were left out of the picture because they either didn't have relationships with banks or they didn't have the wherewithal to apply for the government funding in a speedy manner. When we were kids, my parents had multiple jobs. They worked around the clock. In many Asian American families, family members are working 6 days a week to keep the liquor store open till midnight on a weekend. Those are, when you pump gas at a Pakistani-owned gas station, those are family members that are often there working into the wee hours in order to put that, that household income into the upper brackets, right? And yet, what we also see is that Asian Americans have lower access to healthcare as well. And while I'm on the subject of healthcare, I will say one of the areas that I've noticed during COVID is not only were Asian Americans disproportionately hit with COVID, like there are Black and brown counterparts in large cities like Chinatowns and stuff, but we also have a disproportionate number of Filipino Americans who work in the healthcare industry. So for example, in New Jersey or in Southern California or other places throughout the country, Filipinos came here as a part of an interesting colonial history. It's one of the few places that we as the Americans had a colonial oversight of, and we piped in a cheap labor supply through the Philippines into the healthcare industry during shortages throughout history. And that is why 25% of Filipino Americans work in the healthcare industry. And it's everything from doctors, nurses, orderlies, respiratory therapists, everything, physical therapy, kidney dialysis specialties. All of these people were in a disproportionate level of exposure to COVID. And then on top of that, many of them had multifamily homes, right? Where you come home and grandma is living with us, and there are 3 generations living under one roof. And that was how COVID hit a lot of Asian American communities so hard. And I think that it's important to remember that this is a very diverse ethnic group, Asian Americans, right? But I also wanted to talk a little bit about the unconscious bias that happens against Asian Americans in worlds like in academics, right? So I know I'm speaking to a bunch of different universities and a bunch of different faculty and students, but I want to point out a study that was done by the Wharton School of Business, that's at the University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League business school. But it was research that I found startling. It essentially sent out 6,500 emails across 89 different disciplines, right, at 259 schools across the country. And when I say schools, I mean colleges and universities, right? And the emails had the exact same message. And the only variable on the email was the sender's name. So I'm giving you real examples off of this research. Brad Anderson, Lamar Washington, Latoya Brown, Juanita Martinez, Deepak Patel, Sonali Desai, Chang Wang. So you can imagine these names were deliberately crafted in order to test the racial and gender biases of professors responding. Now, professors, at least off the top of one's head, are among the most woke people we know. They are liberal academics often, or they're conservative academics, but they are, I think if you individually asked any one of them, they'd say, I don't have a lot of unconscious bias. I'm not a prejudiced person, right? Well, in this particular study, 6,500 emails later, the type of student who garnered the most responses, I'm going to let you think about that for a second. The white male. As the researcher told NPR, professors ignored requests from women and minorities at a higher rate than requests from white males. We see a 25% gap in the response rate to Caucasian males versus whites and women and minorities. All they were measuring was how often professors wrote back, agreeing to meet with the students. They found very large disparities. Women and minorities were systematically less likely to get positive responses and to get a reply at all. So these were faculty from liberal arts universities, right? And those were the ones in liberal arts universities were more likely to discriminate. And so I think what are the implications of this? When I hear older, successful CEOs, or frankly, older, successful anythings, often they talk about the key to their success was finding a good mentor. But this research suggests that finding a good mentor or building that mentor relationship may actually be harder for women and minorities. And this is the type of unconscious bias that I think we all need to be aware of, right? And just, because I'm Asian American and the Confucius Institute is bringing this along, the type of student that got the least positive responses from professors were Asians. Asian American names got the least positive response and the least response, period. And if you think of a 25% gap, that is not like a rounding error. And that's not, something that's, you can just write off, right? So when you think of other research that suggests that that kind of unconscious bias exists, it exists everywhere. When they put orchestra tryouts behind curtains so that you couldn't see the gender of the person who was trying out, more women advanced. When they blinded the gender on science grants and didn't put in the gender, more women advanced. In Silicon Valley, when you look at a workforce that is 25% Asian American, but when you look at the C-suites and the boards and the trustees and the ownership ranks, it dwindles down to low single digits, right? So you have to ask yourself, why? And then you have to ask yourself, what can we do to make the inequities more equitable? And I think that those are the kinds of questions that we're now asking ourselves when these kinds of racial inequities are so stark and clear. And I think that's what happened with COVID. You saw infection rates, hospitalization rates, death rates dramatically higher in the African American community, in the Hispanic community, in certain segments of the Asian American community. And then you overlay that and you ask yourself, if you really were to ask yourself why, it's because of the systemic inequities that these communities live in, whether it's, pollution or lack of healthcare or poverty or the fact that they're essential workers and they're exposed. All of those things have to do with racial inequities. And I think we're seeing that in some way, with Asian Americans too, in a variety of realms. So the thing that I would say, because we're getting close to 30 minutes in and I'm dying to hear your questions, is that there are so many examples of that little email study. And so you don't take that email study and you run into your professor's office or you run into your office mate's office and say, you didn't return my email, aha, you're either prejudiced or you have unconscious bias. The truth is, that's probably not the case. Maybe it just got buried in their inbox. Like, what we need to do is check our own, if we're on the receiving end of that email, check our own unconscious bias. Like within ABC News, we recently got a new Outlook application. This was a couple years back, but it showed the photo of the sender, right? And I was cracking up because people's, work photos look like mugshots anyway. So I was like, no one looks good in a work email photo. But I also started realizing that I was slightly discounting things that were coming from somebody who looked like I could be that kid's mother, and that's not fair because their information was just as good. And if I had not known the gender or the age or whatever, I wouldn't have done that. So I was checking my own unconscious bias. And I think that is what we all need to do, is we all need to be aware of the fact that we all have unconscious biases that can be whipped up into hysteria or can be guarded against in ways that can be helpful and move forward. And I think that I have always taken it upon myself to be an ambassador to others for being what it means to be Asian American. And I remember going to a classroom in Franklin, North Carolina. This was probably 20 years ago. And it was a teacher of the year story, and I was in a teacher's classroom, and a couple of the kids came up to me. They were grade schoolers. They came up to me afterwards, and they looked up really close at me, and they said, "Can you see okay through your slanty eyes?" And I thought, and I didn't, it was painful, and yet I thought that was just because they'd never met anyone who'd looked like me. And so rather than take that as an insult, I took it as a opportunity to be an ambassador and to say to these children, why, no, not at all. See, in so many ways, I'm just like you. I just look a little different. And I think that is the larger lesson that we're learning now, is that while we have differences, many of us have far more in common than we do that are different differences. So with that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A. Jennifer's here. I want to know what's on your mind so that we can chat.
We've already got some great questions in the Q&A. First of all, thank you for that talk. That was inspiring and also eye-opening, some of the examples that you gave, and also horrifying. So, we can do better, folks. We can do better. Okay, I'm going to start with the first one. This is out of Murray State University. This is, Murray State. While reports of abuse against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have increased, Korean pop groups like BTS and Blackpink, as well as movies like Parasite, have simultaneously achieved record-breaking success in the United States. What role do you think pop culture can play in deconstructing unconscious bias? In the same vein, while artists from Asia seem to break down barriers and achieve success in the US, how can we ensure that's done with Asian American voices?
That is such a great question. Thank you for that. I would say that representation matters. And that's what the big theme has been. You know, Black Panther was a movie that the company that I work for, Disney, launched. And the fact that it took that long to get, you know, one Black superhero says something about the fear and the misunderstanding that media executives may have about what's gonna sell and what's okay in terms of representation. But the same thing goes with Crazy Rich Asians. And I think when Crazy Rich Asians came out, I interviewed Kevin Kwan, the author, and, you know, the stars and the director. And they talked about how in movie premieres, people, often Asian Americans, were crying watching this portrayal. And I know that I was hit in Crazy Rich Asians. There was a scene where the family is sitting around making dumplings, and they're making dumplings and they're just talking to each other, right? And I thought, that could be my family. And that was the first time that it just happened to be, you know. And I think that representation matters because you start to see your own story and your own possibility represented in a way that makes it okay to aspire to greatness. You know, that's why so much of the conversation right now is to be able to see Kamala Harris, right, who has ascended to this glass shattering role in so many ways. Not only is she, you know, African American, her mother, she's actually not African American, she's Jamaican American. Her mother raised her to be a Black woman in this country, even though her mother was born in India, right? And she went to a historically Black college, and she went to Howard University proud of her heritage. And yet at the same time, she's proud of her Asian side as well. And I think so much of the future of what America is going to look like my children, who are biracial, who, you know, talk about white privilege because they're half white. And they talk about, you know, being Asian American, and what that means, and the assumptions that are made about them, and the jokes and the slurs that are made about them just because of the way they look. And so that, to me, about media representations, just a lot of people, you know, and obviously Bill Cosby is a controversial figure now because he's literally in prison for sexual assault, serial sexual assault. But at the time, the Cosby Show allowed so many Americans to feel like they knew somebody who was Black, that there was a friend that they had who they could relate to, who was Black. And there's an academic who's written this whole thesis about how President Obama could not have happened. The idea of a Black president couldn't have happened were it not for the Cosby Show. The importance of media representation is just that critical.
This next question kind of goes into the journalistic realm a little bit. How would you respond to somebody justifying the use of the phrase China virus simply because we use the term Spanish flu in that pandemic? Related, how do you see important truths being co-opted by such comparisons? So that role
well, that is such a good example, because the Spanish flu was not a flu that was from Spain. It was actually came from the United States. And yet, you know, these kinds of pandemics have been weaponized before. There is a rich history of that. And I think that, you know, in the time of global issues, we can look at damage that has been caused that originates in one country and ends in other countries as kind of our future, whether it's climate change or you know, migration patterns that are triggered in a lot of ways that will be international and global. And I think the idea of what ended up happening by calling it a China virus is that you blamed, you know, an entire race of people, as opposed to really getting at the root causes of why it was here. And ironically, the majority of the COVID in our country, especially through New York, came through Italy. And so the Milan strain of the COVID-19 virus came through, but we don't call it the Italy virus. We call it the China virus. And I think that ultimately this, you know, when we demonize people, we are sort of aiding and abetting that kind of hate.
Okay, the next question is, do you feel that Black or Asian and Asian or Asian Americans experience similar inequities in this country? Is there an opportunity for the two groups to combat anti-racism as a united front?
Absolutely. I think that allyship, so there's many parts to that question. These are such sophisticated questions. I think allyship is important now more than ever, and that Asian Americans have historically in the United States linked arms with their African American brothers. But at the same time, I think we need to be aware of the history and aware of the fact that our circumstances coming to this country are different than the Asian American, African Americans, right? I mean, the enslaved people and the subsequent Jim Crow and the, generations upon generations of I don't know, systemic subjugation is different than the Asian American experience. And again, this is the model minority thing. And part of that is because we came here with oftentimes an education. Like my parents came with graduate degrees, right? People came with some level of capital. Others didn't. Others were fleeing wars and they left Vietnam. And that's the one big thing about Asian Americans is we're not a monolith, right? In any sense. Everybody has a different lived experience. But so I don't ever want to equate what happened to one group to another group. But don't forget that Chinese Americans were indentured servants and essentially were enslaved, building the railroads that built great wealth for the western part of our country, up to and including, the founder of my university, Stanford, which was enriched off the backs of essentially free labor of Chinamen, as they called them in those days. So there's a lot of history, but at the same time, there's another part of the ugly history that we also can't lose sight of. And that is that whenever there were quote unquote race riots, and there are filmmakers and activists who refer to them now as uprisings, not race riots, right? These uprisings that happened in cities often happened in urban metropolitan areas, and there was a lot of burning and destruction of businesses, right? And in the past, those were often Jewish businesses generations ago. And then it's become like Korean businesses, Korean American businesses during the post-Rodney King uprising / LA riots, as they're often referred to. And so there's been a lot of distrust and a lot of anger between the Asian Americans and African Americans. And that is something that we can't paper over. And we have to understand that we need to understand each other and understand each other's lived experiences before we can move forward. And I was just having this conversation with a white, family member of mine who said, just because I'm white doesn't mean I grew up with privilege either, right? So I think we all start making assumptions about each other, and then we, lose sight of the progress that we can hopefully make together.
I'm going to throw in a quick question from me. What role can journalists play in helping bridge these divides? We've seen journalists certainly fan the flames of the division. How can your profession help us talk to each other?
I think words matter. And that is obviously the coin of our realm, right? The currency in our world. But I think what we've learned in these past 4 years that we have to double down on is that facts matter and truth matters. And that is something that, frankly, everyone in every profession should be in favor of. And I've spent the last 4 years, hearing from, the highest levels of government that journalists are the enemy of the people. And that could not be further from the truth. If anything, and as I'm sure I'm speaking to journalism students and academics who understand the importance of the fourth estate, the idea that journalists hold people in power accountable. And that's why we ask tough questions. And that's why we're asking irritating questions, because we're trying to keep people accountable. And I think that journalists are often those who give voice to the voiceless, right? I mean, some of my most powerful stories, and I think what journalists, I think often are inspired by, are opportunities to tell the stories of people who otherwise might not be able to get their story out. So I spent a lot of time last year along the border, following stories of migrants who had been persecuted in their homelands and who were coming to the United States for refuge, but were being turned away in droves, even before they could file an asylum claim, which flies against the face of the international laws that we as a country signed onto post-Holocaust, when we denied entry to war refugees and who were then sent home to be persecuted and often killed. And that is the net effect of at least not listening to asylum claims of refugees. And so those are the kinds of stories. I did a story last year that just got noted for the NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists. It was about trans women of color who have been disproportionately attacked and murdered. And then I did another NABJ nominated piece this year about housing inspectors in the South, actually. And they have so much power over women. And there were numbers of sexual harassment claims, and these women were powerless. They had no power. They were sometimes had a little bit of a criminal record. And so they knew that if they complained, they would lose their housing. Their children would lose the roof over their heads. Imagine the amount of power that a man would have over a woman in that circumstance. And so to be able to give voice to those women who were making claims of sexual harassment was a really powerful, and trust me, these were court documents. We weren't just like taking her word for it. One woman had a recording of a man and a housing inspector who was saying things to her that were criminal, right? And so it's those kinds of stories that I think journalists aspire to a lot.
So this is a question from a faculty member. My students have watched and are reacting to Chimamanda Adichie's Danger of a Single Story. Could you talk about moments when you've been on both sides of the story?
When I've been on both sides of the story. What do you mean by being on both sides of the story, just so that I get it straight?
I'm not sure if I'm interpreting it correctly, but I'm guessing it would be where you could come down on, we get taught in journalism school, but get both sides sometimes.
Yes.
Well, I mean, but where you could come down
where I could see both sides of the story. Absolutely. Yes. So I try to do that all the time. I mean, I think there's a couple of things I want to say. One is there's this idea of a false equivalency, right? That journalists get trapped in a lot. This false equivalency is on the one hand, on the other hand, and as if those two hands are always weighing the same, right? But if you have a story like climate change, where literally 98% of the scientists say, on the one hand, and then you have 2% of the scientists saying, on the other hand, I don't think I think it's malpractice for us to say, well, on the one hand, on the other hand. That's not where we need to come down, right? And I think that is what I mean by that facts matter, that larger truths matter, that we need to give context to a fact, not just like blurt the statistic. We have to explain the fact. And I think that for me, I come down on both sides of an equation a lot. There are often, I'm trying to think of one recently, and I can't remember what it is now, which was I kept thinking, I kept changing my mind privately about the story as I would report, right? And I'm hoping it'll come to me, but it would be like, I don't know how to think about that. And oh, that person said this thing. And oh, that person's made a really smart remark. Oh, that person, and I really try to be an honest broker. I really try to, as baseball fans would say, call balls and strikes as I see them, and try not to inflate the strike zone, to suit my tastes. I really, really try to be a fair arbiter of truths, because let's face it, people can shade truths all they want. But I do think that it's important to listen to people, and that's why I interview as many people as I can. After the Governor Whitmer plot, I went and spent time with militia people and tried to hear their side of the story. And basically they disavowed themselves from the plotters. And they said, what people misunderstand about militia guys is that we just like to have freedom of expression and freedom to bear arms. And we go outside and like to be independent. So we have some target practice, and then we build a campfire, and we do all these things. We're like overgrown Boy Scouts with guns. And the way that they described it to me, made me realize that we don't need to demonize each other, that we're humans first.
This one, it talks a little bit about the model minority point that you brought up. There are some Asian and Asian Americans who also have bias, conscious or unconscious, against other minorities. For example, there are Asian people who strongly are against affirmative action because it takes away opportunities from Asian and gives them to other minorities. How would you address that? What do you think? How would you talk to the Asian people who think that their slice of cake is taken away from them by other minorities?
That is the affirmative action issue is the issue that I always bring up when I talk about how the Asian American community is not a monolith, right? Because right before the election, I did a panel with 5 Asian American candidates for Congress. It was a record number. And a couple of them were Republicans and 3 of them were Democrats. And they had different policy ideas, right? And they represented different demographics of Asian Americans. And a little bit like the Cuban Americans, there are some Asian Americans who come here fleeing communist oppression. And the thing that is the boogeyman for them is socialism. And so, they feel very strongly that they're not going to, they're not going to be Democrats. They're going to be Republicans, right? For me, there are plenty of arguments that I've listened to on the affirmative action story. But I will say that to me, there is more that there are more arenas in which Asian Americans have a net benefit from affirmative action policies. I'm not stating an opinion, I'm stating a fact. Does that make sense? So for example, the thing I mentioned about what is often referred to as the bamboo ceiling, right? In Silicon Valley, there are disproportionate numbers of Asian Americans in the workforce. We are the worker bees. We're known as hardworking, right? But we're not promoted. And often we're not promoted for the same kinds of reasons that women aren't promoted. It's those kind of, she doesn't have leadership skills. Well, what does that mean exactly? He doesn't have la la la. And so to me, when you look at the leadership, the upper echelons of executive suites throughout this country, Asian Americans are still underrepresented. And so in colleges, what I would say is there are so many studies done. And I understand that people feel like, and in New York City, it's even more so because we have these things called specialized high schools and people test in, and then it's 85% Asian Americans because everybody's tested in. I totally respect people who feel like affirmative action hurts Asian Americans in, elite universities. But I would argue that if Asian Americans, if they just based it on test scores, like some of these high schools in New York that are 75-80% Asian American, that ultimately would be a disservice to Asian Americans, that wouldn't be a good thing. So it's really about taking a larger frame when you're looking at the issue. And I get it. I get that people feel like, well, my slot was, and I've been discriminated against. But I would argue that one of the best things about our country is that there are so many fabulous schools. There are 5 schools in Kentucky that are joining on this Zoom that are excellent places to get a journalism degree, an excellent place to get, and that you don't have to go to one of the 12 or 15 quote unquote Gucci universities. You can go to one of the 300 and get just as much out of it. And so it's really a question of equity and representation, and that those larger principles are what guide those who are in favor of affirmative action.
I want to be mindful of our time, so I'm going to ask you one last question. But before that, I do want to tell you that we've got lots of folks in the chat and in the Q&A that are thanking you for this powerful speech. They're thanking you as Asian Americans, as people who have immigrated from Asian countries, and about how much it means for you to come and talk, and again how much it means for all of the universities to have sponsored this talk, and making sure that this community is seen and the issues of concern are brought out and we're all talking about them. So the final question that I want to ask you, I think it's a great one. How optimistic are you about America's ability to reduce prejudice in our society, and why?
I think that I am by nature an optimistic person, and I think all journalists are skeptical optimists. Wouldn't you agree, Jennifer?
Absolutely.
And that's different than cynical.
Right.
Optimist, right? I'm a skeptical optimist because I want to fact check you first.
Yeah, we want to make the world better. That's why we got into this profession. So
that's exactly right. And we believe in the power of storytelling, and we believe that we can get to people's humanity. And so I am optimistic that we can turn down the heat and turn down the divisiveness that has, I think, made it difficult for us to communicate with each other as humans. And I think that we have arguably the best scientists in the world. I think we have some of the best philosophers and thinkers in the world. I think we are compassionate, and we are democratic in the true sense, the small d sense of the word, and that is what makes this country great. I mean, I have to say, I have spent the past 30 years traveling this country. And what I am astonished by is, along with the colleges that I just said, you could go to 100 colleges and get a fantastic, not 100, hundreds of, and get a fantastic, you can also go to just about any city in this country and have an amazing life, right? Whether it's San Antonio, Texas, or Louisville, Kentucky, or Nashville, or Boulder, Colorado, or there's so many not huge cities, right? That of course I live in Manhattan, so to me, Louisville's not that huge a city, but I go to small towns and I find beautiful coffee bars and excellent artisanal farms and thinkers and doers, and I'm inspired by people every time I go out into the country, because they're out there quietly doing their thing, and I think that's what makes America so strong, and I think that we are much stronger, obviously, together, united, than divided, and so my optimism for that is high.
Well, I think we needed to end on an optimistic note after the time we've all been through. Again, we want to thank you so much for your time and bringing these insights, and for answering the questions and helping push us to be better, because we can be better. As I wrap up, I just again want to give thanks to Awajim Maskey and to all of the sponsors, all of our great universities who joined together across Commonwealth of Kentucky to put on this great event. And with that, we thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here. Bye, Wai Jing. Thank you all. Be well. Have a great day.
Thank you, Juju.